welcome to another video. Now that we are well and truly into the depths of September, I feel like it's time to talk you through my autumn TBR. Now specifically, these are books which are maybe like a tiny bit creepy or cozy, but not spooky, because I'm going to be sharing a separate October spooky season TBR when we get closer to Halloween. But for now, I'm more focusing on the books that I really want to read throughout autumn that I think are just perfect for this season or have been on my TBR for a really long time. And these will probably be the books that I either read in the rest of September or in November before I move on to Christmas books in December. So without further ado, I have 10 books that I've picked out because I feel like that's a reasonable amount that I could actually feasibly achieve and complete before the end of autumn. So let's get into it. So the first book I've got on my autumn TBR is a retelling of my favourite classic of all time, and actually just in general one of my favourite books of all time, and that book is Frankenstein. So the retelling I'm talking about is The Dark Descent of Elizabeth Frankenstein. So this is of course a Frankenstein retelling, but this time focusing on the character of Elizabeth. For those of you who are not familiar with Frankenstein, Elizabeth is a character who initially is Victor Frankenstein's adopted sister, and as the book goes on, she becomes a romantic interest and eventually his wife. So that's an interesting dynamic, which is kind of gross and obviously wouldn't happen now, but that book was written in the 1800s when I guess that was still acceptable. But regardless, Elizabeth is a character from the main Frankenstein story, but she's a character that doesn't get very much development at all. It's kind of surprising because obviously Mary Shelley was a young female author, but her book still does predominantly focus on the male characters of her story, and Elizabeth kind of exists as this perfect, virtuous female who just exists to be purely good and to bring good into the world, and then to essentially become a victim who needs protection. So she's not a character that gets very much focus, and for that reason I'm really excited to see how Kirsten White explores her character in this book, because to be honest, she could do whatever she wants because there's not really much raw initial material to go off of. Elizabeth is such an underdeveloped character, and so there's a lot of different things that she could do. It sounds really interesting. It starts off when she gets adopted by the family. So it says, Elizabeth Lavenza hasn't had a proper meal in weeks. Her thin arms are covered with bruises from her caregiver, and she's on the verge of being thrown into the streets until she's brought to the home of Victor Frankenstein, an unsmiling, solitary boy who has everything except a friend. Victor is her escape from misery. Elizabeth does everything she can to make herself indispensable, and it works. She's taken in by the Frankenstein family and rewarded with a warm bed, delicious food, dresses of the finest silk, and soon she and Victor are inseparable. But her new life comes at a price. As the years pass, Elizabeth's survival depends on managing Victor's dangerous temper and indulging his every whim, no matter how depraved. Behind her blue eyes and sweet smile lies the calculating heart of a girl determined to stay alive whatever the cost, as the world she knows is consumed by darkness. Ooh, that sounds really good. It doesn't sound like she's going to change Elizabeth's fate, but more just to explore how she feels about the situation, because like I said, in the initial Frankenstein, we are just sort of shown this girl who's absolutely perfect and always happy and always virtuous and pure and good, and I feel like this is going to delve into maybe the more calculating side of why she takes on that perfect and virtuous personality to the outside world. So I'm really excited for this one. Sounds super interesting. My friend Mary from the channel Mary Among Stories actually gifted me this one, and I think we're going to buddy read it together. The next book I've got on my list is one that I've been meaning to read for a really long time, but something about the colours on the cover of this book just make it feel quite autumnal, and that book is Far from the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy. This is the first Thomas Hardy that I will have ever read, so I'm really excited, and hopefully I'll really enjoy his writing style so that I can read more of his books, because I also want to read Tess of the D'Urbervilles and some of his other books as well, but those are kind of like my top ones, Far from the Madding Crowd and Tess. But this one I want to start with mostly because I love the cover, and also I know there is a film adaptation starring Carey Mulligan who I really like, so I'm hoping to enjoy this one. What I understand about this book, which granted isn't a lot because I don't know a huge amount of detail, is that it focuses on our main character Bathsheba, and I believe that she's a woman who comes into some money and owns land, which is obviously quite unusual for a woman at the time that this book is set, and then she is kind of involved in a few different romantic relationships. I think, with 3 different men, and that causes her a lot of issues and I think a lot of scandal. So I think it's going to be a really interesting social commentary style book, and I'm looking forward to seeing how it explores the theme of a woman having more power than would typically be expected at this time. Next up, I have a thriller which was sent to me by Molly from the channel Mind of Molly. She actually sent it to me quite a while ago now, but I've kind of just left it on my shelves because I've been busy and had other reading plans, but it's kind of worked out perfectly because, like I said, it's a thriller which I think is perfect for early autumn. That thriller is The One That Got Away by Simon Wood, which is a thriller that I think focuses on a serial killer. Molly seemed to say that it was multiple perspective and that one of the perspectives is the killer, which I think is so interesting, and I really, really like that. I've recently enjoyed reading The Hunting Party and The Guest List by Lucy Foley, which are murder mysteries with multiple perspectives. So one of the perspectives that you get is always the murderer, but you just don't know who it's going to be. And I really find that to be like an interesting twist to get an insight into everyone's minds, so both victim and murderer. And I think that is going to be the case in this book as well. And I just think it's perfect because although it's a thriller, so it'll definitely be quite intense and dark, it's not specifically spooky or horror-y. And so I feel like it's going to be a great one to like introduce me into the spooky season before I get properly into some dark books in October. And with that being said, I also have another thriller on my TBR which I actually have already started but kind of just abandoned, and so I'm going to be starting it again from scratch, and that is The Secret She Keeps by Michael Rowbotham. I started this one in July when I was taking part in a readathon, so you can actually probably hear me talking about the first, like, how far did I get? Let's find out. The first 220 pages of this book is what I made it through, and this book has about 500, so I'm a little under halfway. And this is a dual perspective thriller which focuses on 2 women. We have Agatha and Megan, both of whom are pregnant and both of whom are keeping some pretty dark secrets from their partners, from themselves, from everyone else in their lives. And then gradually as this book goes on, these 2 women's lives start interchanging and crossing over, and they start crossing paths more and more, and I think that their lies and secrets and the deception that they've got going on starts to become twisted and get very, very intense. Now, I remember from the bits of the book that I did read that it was really interesting and super gripping, and that the part that I left off at was starting to get very intense, and I think some secrets were starting to get revealed, which is obviously exciting and really, really thrilling, which is what you want from a thriller. And the reason I stopped reading this book wasn't because I wasn't enjoying it, it was because I had a few other reading commitments to get to. I was doing some book clubs and some readathons and all kinds of other things, and it just kind of got pushed to the bottom of my priorities, and I just felt like by the time I was actually ready to come back to it, it had been too long to pick up from where I left off. So I've decided to just pop this one into my autumn TBR and start from scratch so that I can get the full thrillery experience. And I think this one is actually going to be one of the top priorities on this TBR, and one of the ones that I'm going to be reading first, just because, first of all, I've already started it, so I feel like it's only fair to this book to get to it before the other ones, and then also because there is a BBC adaptation that was out recently, and I'm hoping that's still on iPlayer so that I can watch it after reading the book. So the next book that I want to pick up is one that has been highly recommended to me, and I feel like it's one that a lot of people have read, so I definitely feel a little bit behind in having not picked it up yet, but that is Vicious by V.E. Schwab. This is the first book in a duology which is made up of vicious and vengeful, and from what I understand about this book, it's going to be very dark and very interesting, which I'm really glad about because the only other V.E. Schwab book that I've read was A Darker Shade of Magic, and in my opinion that just was not dark enough. I wanted it to be an even darker shade of magic because it just felt a little bit too surface level-y and just not quite as intense as I'd hoped for. But I mentioned that in some of my reviews and wrap-ups, including that book, and in that some people told me that Vicious was kind of what I was looking for and was definitely a book that would go into that darker side of humanity and just sort of be a little bit more intense. I also feel like this book sounds like a dark academia with a paranormal twist, which sounds so interesting because I've never read a dark academia that has had anything paranormal in there, and I think that's going to be a really interesting combination and especially perfect for this time of year as we approach spooky season. Now, the reason I say that this is a dark academia is because it's set in a college setting, or at least the beginning of the book is, and I believe that it focuses on 2 college roommates, Victor and Eli, who are both science students and are involved in some experiments to do with the like prolonging of life and kind of like immortality, I guess. And then through these experiments, they basically figure out that people can develop superpowers, but their experiments go kind of like terribly wrong, and that causes some rifts between the two of them and some quite dramatic consequences. I don't know much about it other than that, aside from the fact that this is meant to be on 2 timelines, which I think is going to be really interesting. So we'll have kind of like the lead up to this experiment and how these superpowers are discovered, and then the aftermath of that experiment and what happens in the future. So I think that's going to be a really interesting combination, and it's one that I'm really excited to read at the end of September or beginning of October, I think. The next book I've got is one that I feel like I've talked about loads of times and said how excited I am to read it, but just haven't gotten around to yet, and that is The House on the Strand by Daphne du Maurier. Now, I love Daphne du Maurier so much, and I'm actually also going to be reading Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier in October because I'm hosting a read-along called Rebecca Long alongside my friend Jess, and I think that's going to be so much fun. But I also thought that this autumn would be the perfect chance to read a new Daphne du Maurier because I haven't actually picked up a new one of her books in quite a long time. The last one I read was some point last year when I read My Cousin Rachel, but I haven't picked up anything else by her in a while, and so I'm really, really excited to read this one. This one kind of sounds a little bit paranormal and spooky because it's a book which focuses on our main character who is a doctor, but he starts taking some drugs which transport him into a 14th century universe, and he loves it there. He has a great time and becomes kind of obsessed with it, and so he takes these drugs more and more because he wants to spend all of his time in this 14th century world. But of course that causes him to withdraw from his actual real life, and so it's going to be a really interesting book, and I can't tell whether or not it's actually about time travel or whether it's more just about the effects of this drug and what they do to this character's mind. But either way, I think it's going to be really, really interesting, and I cannot wait to read it because it sounds so unique, and I definitely think it's going to be a really, really good one. The next book I've got is quite a high priority for me, and that book is Mansfield Park by Jane Austen. Now, the reason that this is such a high priority for me is because I love Jane Austen, and this is the last one of her books that I have yet to read. After reading this, I'm going to be doing a full and comprehensive ranking of all of her books, and I'm also thinking about going back to them and reading them in publication order to see whether that kind of impacts my experience of reading them and what I think of them. But I don't want to do that until I've finished all of the books at least once, and then I can go back and reread them as many times as I want and in as many orders as I like. But I do just really, really want to read this one. I know absolutely nothing about this one. It's definitely her largest book, or at least it is in the editions that I've got. I don't know, it's hard for me to judge because I have 3 of her books in this vintage classic edition, and they are quite short in terms of height, and then they're quite chunky, whereas some of my other books that I have of hers are taller and obviously not as chunky, so it's hard for me to tell which one is longer. But I think this is definitely one of her larger books, and the only thing I know about it is what it says on the back, which is "A large income is the best recipe for happiness that I ever heard of," and that sounds very interesting and kind of true as well. So I'm really excited to read this one and to conclude my experience of reading all of the Jane Austen novels for the first time. So the next book I've got is one that I actually know very, very little about, and the reason I'm so excited to read this book and the reason it's made its way onto my autumn TBR is because of the fact that I read this author's other book earlier this summer. That book was so incredible and atmospheric, and I felt like the atmosphere was really, really perfect for autumn, and so I'm hoping that I'll get the same experience from this second book. And that book is The Starless Sea by Erin Morgenstern, which I believe has one of the most beautiful book covers I've ever seen. Now, like I said, I did read The Night Circus earlier this summer, I think in June, and I loved it. It was so incredible, and I was so glad that I finally read it because it's a book that I've been meaning to read for a long time. The plot of The Night Circus was incredible, as I'm sure any of you who have read the book will know, but it wasn't the plot that made me love the book so much, but more so Erin Morgenstern's writing style, which was so captivating and just atmospheric and so picturesque that it really felt like you were being transported into the pages of the book. Everything felt so vivid and all-encompassing that you really felt like you were experiencing everything that was going on in the book, and that is why I'm so excited to read this one, because I feel like regardless of what she's writing about, it will just feel so vivid and absolutely incredible. I'm actually going to read the blurb of this book because I haven't yet. I was just so pulled in by the fact that I knew I wanted to read it and also the cover, so let's find out what it's about. It says, "Are you lost or are you exploring? When Zachary Rowland stumbles across a mysterious library book containing details from his own life among its pages." That sounds really interesting. It leads him on a quest unlike any other. Following the clues inside, he's guided to a masquerade party, a dangerous secret club, and finally to a labyrinth filled with stories hidden far beneath the surface of the earth. But when the labyrinth is threatened, Zachary must race through its twisting tunnels and crowded ballrooms, searching for the end of his story. Oh my god! I need to read that right now. That sounds so good. I'm so excited to read this one. That sounds incredible. The next book I've got is one which mostly captivated me by its cover, but then having seen it quite a few times in Waterstones and finally decided to pick it up and read what it was about, I've discovered that this book actually sounded right up my street, especially given the fact that I've been really into dark academia recently, and that book is The Truants by Kate Weinberg. Now, like I said, the cover pulled me in, and that is because it's so yellow, and I feel like that's a colour that I don't see done very often. It's so bright, and obviously, as you'll probably be able to tell from my choices of yellow jumpers quite often, I am a big fan of the colour yellow, and so that really pulled me in. But then reading the description of this book, it sounds like a quite intriguing dark academia. We focus on our main character Jess, who is in her first year of university, and I think like a lot of people, being at university and having a bit of a new sort of life setting has caused her to kind of reevaluate and kind of reinvent herself, and I feel like she falls into some interesting circles, particularly involving a professor, and that kind of leads her down a dark path. And the end line of this blurb says, "Soon Jess is faced with the question she fears most: what is the true cost of an extraordinary life?" And that sounds like such an interesting theme of a book, and I cannot wait to read it. So I think this one is definitely going to be a really, really interesting read, and I'm hoping I'm going to like it. And then the final book on this autumn TBR is one that I actually meant to read at the end of summer, but didn't get around to, but I actually think that's probably good timing, because I think it's probably better suited to the beginning of autumn. And that book is Little Fires Everywhere by Celeste Ang. I intended to read this one for the Summerween readathon that was hosted by Gabby from Gabby Reads and Olivia from Olivia Reads a Latte, but I just didn't have time to read all of the books on that TBR, and in fact I only read 2 of the 5 books that I hoped to read, so it wasn't a brilliant reading week, but that does mean that I have this book still waiting for me at the beginning of autumn. I don't know a huge amount about it because I understand that it's got some kind of thrillery tendencies. I believe it's described as a domestic drama, but my understanding is that there's definitely some thrillery elements thrown in, and the cover definitely leads me to sort of have that opinion. And it's basically a book which focuses on this quite like well-off and affluent community, and then this mother and daughter move into the community and are a little bit different from everyone else, and for that reason they're kind of the cause of a lot of buzz. People are really intrigued by them and attracted to them, but I think there's also a lot of drama surrounding their entry to this community and the things that they do once they get there. So it sounds really intriguing. I've heard great things about this book as well as just Celeste Ang in general, so I'm really excited to finally read one of her books this autumn. So those are the books that I'm most excited to read this autumn. Obviously I'm hoping to read more than the ones I've mentioned, but these are my top priorities. I also have mentioned that I'll be sharing a specific spooky TBR at the beginning of October, but for now these 10 books are the ones that I'm most excited to start delving into and hopefully feeling very cozy whilst reading with a hot drink and probably an autumnal candle burning behind me. Now, if you've got an autumn TBR, I'd love to know what you're planning to read this season, or if you've got any autumnal, cozy or spooky recommendations, I'd love to hear them as well, because I'm always looking for more books to add to my TBR. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.